governance, a regional assessment and approach. I am Anna Alvazzi del Frate. I am a founding director of CANIS, Knowledge for Safety and Good Governance, and the vice chair of the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. We will have only two speakers today, Emile Lebrun and Christian Ponti, as our colleague Gergely Hideg may not be able to join us. I will present a couple of slides on his behalf, and we thank him in advance for his input. Emile and Christian will have about 12 to 15 minutes at each at their disposal for their presentation. At the end of all presentations, we will open the floor for questions. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat and or indicate that you would like to be given the floor. As usual, please stay muted unless you are given the floor. I will give you now a short introduction to our topic. This panel represents the continuation of a work that we started in 2020, through a panel organized at the 24-hour conference on organized crime at its first edition. And then again in 2021, and then in side events that we organized in the margins of the 7th biennial meeting of states of the program of action on small arms and light weapons in New York in 2021, and the 11th conference of the parties to the UN Convention against Transnational Organized Crime in Vienna in 2022. We published an article on this. I will put the link in the chat in a minute for those who are interested. And we are now advancing our research from the global level to the regional level that is quite rich of conventions and agreements regulating firearms and small arms and light weapons. So what we would like to find is whether there is a connection between effective implementation of instruments, especially international instruments that give a mandate to adhering states to adopt domestic legislation in line with them, if there is a connection between effective implementation of these instruments and a possible reduction of armed violence. We know, in fact, that even if it may appear that, for example, the firearm protocol or other instruments, they may have explicitly a goal of reducing illicit trafficking in firearms. Their ultimate goal is reducing misuse of firearms and related consequences such as killings and victimization. So our research now is trying to become a bit more sophisticated to try to identify indicators and sources of information that may enrich the analysis. And for this, I think that we will revisit a bit what we have achieved so far and the challenges ahead. So I would like now to give the floor to Emile Lebrun, our first speaker, Senior Small Arms Policy Control Consultant, Project Coordinator for the Small Arms Survey, and Founding Director of CANIS, Knowledge for Safety and Good Governance. Emile, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. Good afternoon, good day, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be back at the 24-hour conference on global organized crime after a year of being away. I think I have the easy part of this discussion. I have the easy part of this presentation because it's my role to sort of simply articulate the questions and the challenges that we're trying to address here. And my colleagues have a bit more of the complicated question of how to address those challenges. What are the indicators and the tools and the methods that we need to answer those questions. But I hope to be also taking part in the conversation at the end of the session. So let me start with some initial reflections. Most participants will be closely familiar with the UNTOC and the Firearms Protocol, adopted in May 2001 and coming into force in May 2005. It was and remains a foundational first wave arms control instrument. As an arms control person myself, it's very much a part of our landscape. It's the only legally binding international instrument that's focused on requiring domestic firearms regulations around these areas. And so together with the 2001 Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons that Anna just mentioned, the protocol really is a key reference for the global community of states, researchers, practitioners, and civil society that's focused on armed violence. And for those seeking to understand and address the role that firearms play in different kinds of violence, criminal violence, family violence, but we should also not forget suicide as well. So with that in mind, let me see if I can share a slide. So I'm going to say a few things around developing a theory or assessing a theory of change for the Firearms Protocol. So while the protocol is a foundational document, unfortunately, it has the lowest adherence of the three UNTOC protocols, the other two being on the smuggling of immigrants and the trafficking of persons. The first decade of the Firearms Protocol was quite promising. You can see by this chart that through 2013, 107 states had ratified the Firearms Protocol. The problem has been in the second decade of the protocol, uptake has been very slow. In the second decade, only 15 additional states had ratified the protocol over that period. So now, as of 2023, there are 122 state parties with relatively good regional distribution across the regions. In terms of the activity of the UNTOC process, and when I say UNTOC process, what I mean is specifically referencing the Firearms Protocol. So I'm talking about the Conference of State Parties, the Committee on Firearms, and since 2020, the review mechanism itself. All of the activity around that process has really been geared towards the challenges of universalization and implementation, getting more states to adhere to the protocol, and then getting them to implement the provisions by enacting them into national law and providing assistance to states that need assistance in doing that. And so that focus on universalization and implementation is not unusual because these are the nuts and bolts of treaty and convention processes. This is how they advance at the practical and technical levels. And it's incredibly time consuming and resource intensive. So it takes time for these processes to get up and running. But I think it's important for the UNTOC community to take a step back and consider the long-term goals of the convention and the protocol to help ensure that all of this activity is having tangible results in the world, in the lives of people. For example, if after 22 years of activity, we have seen that there's no real effect in the world of these activities, we might legitimately, and others might ask as well, what the value is of this instrument. And in the case of the Firearms Protocol, there's a rather clear long-term objective, and Anna hinted at it in her opening comments, but it does need to be unpacked. Specifically in the context of the UNTOC's focus on transnational organized crime, the objectives of the Firearms Protocol are very clear. They're clearly stated in the preamble of the protocol, and I'll just quote them very quickly. The objective is to prevent, combat, and eradicate the illicit manufacture and trafficking in firearms, their parts and components, and in so doing, to reduce the harmful effects on the security of states and the well-being of people, their social and economic development, and their rights to live in peace. That's language directly from the preamble to the protocol. So with that in mind, and with an understanding of what the legal requirements of the protocol are, we could develop a theory of change for the protocol itself. And I think at first blush that theory of change would be rather straightforward. It would go something like this. 1, states parties take legal and administrative steps to curb illicit firearms manufacture and illicit trafficking. 2, those legal and administrative steps have the intended reductions on illicit manufacturing and trafficking. 3, those reductions prevent firearms from reaching the hands of criminals likely to use them to commit violence. And 4, partly as a result of these steps, improvements in well-being and social and economic development are achieved. So if we subjected the firearms protocol to a log frame, much as we have to do for our own work with donors to propose projects and to evaluate them, those would be a good place to start for understanding the objectives, the activities, the outputs, and the short and long-term outcomes and impacts. But to evaluate the firearms protocol, according to this theory of change, we need indicators. And then we need to collect and access data that would allow us to quantify, to measure changes along those indicators. What should we do and where should we start in regard to those? Well, I think also the language of the preambles is still a good place to start because it has a specific sort of area of focus, and that's social and economic development. At the broadest level, the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, provide a composite picture of socioeconomic development, imperfect as they may be. But also there are specific indicators that may be of particular relevance. For example, indicator 16.1.1 on intentional homicides, as well as 16.4.2 on the proportion of seized, found, and surrendered firearms that are traced successfully of illicit origin. Unfortunately, 16.4.2 is a problematic indicator for many reasons. We don't have a lot of the data that would allow us to evaluate what the proportion of seized and traced firearms of illicit origin might be. And so that's a rather weak indicator. But intentional homicide might be a better place to start, even though this too is a sort of imperfect proxy, I would say. We don't know, for example, what the relationship is between intentional homicides and firearms violence committed with illicitly manufactured or trafficked firearms. Nevertheless, it is one possible place to start, and data is probably available for it. And my colleagues will discuss this and other indicators in their interventions to follow. In any case, as the previous slide showed, we have a bit of a natural experiment going on. We have 122 states that have adopted the protocol. They had different levels of violence and homicide prior to adhering to the protocol. Some of those states have been parties for more than 20 years. Others have been parties for a much shorter length of time. Some have taken steps to enact legislation. Others have taken no steps whatsoever. And of course, we know about the other states that haven't adhered to the protocol. They can be considered a control group to some degree and can be similarly divided into different categories. But what starts out as, I think, a rather innocent question, what are the impacts of the firearms protocol on intentional homicide? They quickly become rather complex. And I'll just mention a couple of the issues around the complexity of the question. One problem is somehow to account for the other factors that affect levels of homicide beyond what states do to reduce illicit manufacture and trafficking. Part of the challenge is to understand and account for those factors. A second problem is assessing what steps were taken in line with what instruments. The firearms protocol is not the only instrument that relates to legal changes that are required to deal with illicit firearms. There are other international instruments, there are other regional instruments, and there are other national policies that have been enacted and adopted since 2001. How do we separate out the origins of the particular steps that states take and attribute them to different instruments? And then a third complexity is just getting access to the relevant data, not only for the impact indicators that we choose to use, but for the intermediary outcomes, the steps that states take to implement the protocol. Much of the information lies outside the hands of researchers' easy access. Civil society does not have an officially sort of deep role in the review process itself, so that's not a way to access data yet. So it would be interesting for us to talk to outside parties that might not have had engagement in this process so far, such as parliamentarians that might have access to new sources of data around the enactment of laws in protocol implementation. And these complexities sort of lead me to my final point, which is about the need to stimulate state party interest in helping us to ask and answer the difficult question about impacts of the protocol. We need their partnership, not only for access to data, but for the legitimacy of the whole exercise. The best candidates for partnerships are those states that believe in the protocol and its long-term goals, and also believe in the importance of evaluation, transparency, and cooperation with researchers and civil society. What would our arguments be to convince them to partner with us? I'll just mention two things. I think that demonstrating positive impacts of adherence will support treaty convention implementation, and will provide valuable inputs into implementation and compliance discussions that are taking place as part of the review mechanism. And I believe my colleagues will touch on these aspects in their comments as well. The last thing I'd say is that I believe the only thing that's certain here is that states can't do this kind of evaluation without experts such as those represented around the table and others like them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emil. Thank you also for bringing us into a way to look at these things from the point of view of the theory of change. As I mentioned, I think that I will take the liberty to present a couple of slides from Gergely. So if you can show me this, what can we measure and how, the next slide show a little bit the chain of events that is an elaboration of the theory of change that you mentioned, Emil. Indeed, what we have is the beginning, that is the identification of a problem. So we know that what we have is a problem. It can be high violence, or we know that some states may access an international instrument because they have peace, on the contrary, because they want to preserve a very safe environment. So the starting point for a state to access and ratify an international instrument may be different. Some may have high levels of violence, some may have low levels of violence and would like to preserve this situation. So we may have the problem anyway identified of high gun violence. And then we have the normative pillar that is represented by a series of elements. We have national initiatives that may come before or after the international ones. We have the international arms control instruments, some of them legally binding, like the firearm protocol that we mentioned before. So that means that domestic legislation must be in line with that. And then we have the regional instruments. So the second pillar is all the normative framework. Then we get into the implementation and the compliance and these levels that lead to actually what happens and the enforcement of these of the norms and the possibility to make sure that the laws, they don't remain on paper, but they are really they represent the backbone of the policy. And finally, we have the impacts that should be measurable. In the next slide, what we have tried to do so far is to check what we can already monitor on the basis of the available information. And of course, the identification of the problem we may have, yes, we may have data that indicate what is the starting point. We may lack a bit information on national initiatives. We have information on the accession of international instruments and regional instruments. And then we may start lacking data and information on these middle points about compliance, about implementation, and about enforcement of these norms. So in the end, what we have in the last pillar, that is the measurable reduction of armed violence, we may have the data, although sometimes it is still patchy, still lacking some granularity, some detail, and some especially disaggregation. We are still short of data disaggregated by sex, for example, data disaggregated by a number of other categories. But we need to find a way to connect the beginning to the end, to try to establish, if not causality, but a little bit of a relationship between the beginning and the end of this chain. So I hope that this was rendering justice to Gergely's presentation, and I'm sorry that he cannot be here to present it himself. And with this, I would like to give the floor now to Christian Ponti. Professor Ponti is Associate Professor of International Law at the University of Milan and the co-founder of the Organized Crime Observatory CROSS at the University of Milan. So, Christian, you have the floor.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to the organizer of this 24-hour conference on organized crime. I'm really happy to take part in this conference again with my colleagues to return to discuss this important topic. Specifically, my remarks will focus primarily on inputs and suggestions to advance the impact of legal indicators on armed violence reduction in the context of the Firearm Protocol, and especially in light of the most recent development of its review mechanism. Previous meetings we had on this topic during 2020 and 2021 edition of the conference provide some important insights that I would like to recall briefly in the first part of my presentation as a basis of our discussion today. As Emile already pointed out, we had come to a first important general conclusion that while being an instrument that presents essentially a criminal justice approach, the Firearm Protocol can nonetheless offer an important contribution to the reduction of armed violence. To this respect, a methodological criteria on which we agree is that, as Anna already said, the focus of the Firearm Protocol is on criminalization, investigation, and prosecution of illicit manufacturing of and illicit trafficking in firearms. Any possible correlation between the impact of its normative provision on armed violence should be represented as in terms of indirect association rather than strict and direct causation. Another methodological finding of primary importance, in my view, arising from our past discussion, is that to measure the impact of the Firearm Protocol on armed violence properly, it is necessary to disaggregate data and outcomes resulting from the different cycles that characterize its life as an international treaty. Here I refer especially to ratification, implementation of, and compliance with the treaty. This because each phase implies different level of commitment by states and may offer peculiar insights on armed violence reduction. This exercise is complicated by the fact that each of the above referred phases, ratification, implementation, compliance, involves different actors at national level, parliamentarian, policy makers, practitioners, and spanning a medium to long-term time frame. For instance, the ratification of the Firearm Protocol at domestic level does represent, of course, an important step by which states become parties to a treaty, and therefore assume voluntarily a legal duty to implement the Firearm Protocol, as well as to enact domestic legislation that they deem necessary to comply with the obligation arising from the protocol. However, ratification does not necessarily implementation of it is only the first step towards the effective implementation of and compliance with the Firearm Protocol. And consequently, it may bring only a limited contribution to shed light on its impact on armed violence. Moreover, as already said by Anna, the ratification of the Firearm Protocol may be driven by very different reasons in terms of national policies. In fact, if you take a look, the reality states that may present different levels of armed violence that are not comparable across countries of different continents. This indicator may explain why, for example, the ratification of the protocol itself that does not constitute a figure directly correlated with the reduction of armed violence in the ratifying states. Indeed, there are states, for instance, in the Latin American continent that have ratified the treaty with high level of violence, and conversely, states that have not ratified the treaty with low rates of armed violence. This consideration allows for another general conclusion, namely that the desirable universalization of the Firearm Protocol, a target that, as Emil said, is still far from being achieved. We are currently 122 states parties, could certainly mark a significant achievement, but it would not be decisive to reduce armed violence around the world. This reasoning brings us to a key point of our reflection on legal indicators, namely that maximizing the impact of the Firearm Protocol normative framework on armed violence reduction requires a full operationalization domestically and internationally of this treaty in terms of effective cooperation among states parties. To this purpose, crucial legal indicator may arise from data and information about coherence of national legislation with the Firearm Protocol norms, effective implementation of domestic laws, and compliance with the Firearm Protocol. Of course, this conclusion could be expanded to other international and regional instruments for armed controls. If you deem me interesting, I would be pleased to go into more detail during our discussion on possible legal indicator linked with implementation and compliance with the Firearm Protocol. Our discussion brought to light that a major limitation to the full operationalization of the Firearm Protocol, both domestically and internationally, largely depend on the limited knowledge about states parties' effective efforts to implement and to make working the Firearm Protocol in practice. This constraint has hindered for a long a desirable impact assessment of the Firearm Protocol on armed violence, and it's apparently due to two main reasons. First, the fact that before the adoption of the review mechanism, I will come in a while on this point, the monitoring of the Firearm Protocol implementation by states parties relied exclusively on a self-assessment approach, according to which states themselves evaluate their own performances. Second, the limited transparency and inclusiveness that has characterized the implementation process of the Firearm Protocol in the past, which to a large extent marginalized the role of civil society in the review process. Another relevant achievement of our discussion linked with the previous observation rely on the fact that the adoption of the Firearm Protocol review mechanism in 2018 represented not only a turning point in the life of this important treaty in tackling illicit manufacturing of and illicit trafficking in firearms, but also a crucial step to assess more properly the effective impact of its normative framework on armed violence reduction. Basically, this assumption stands on two main features of this new monitoring mechanism that we have identified as potential strengths that may substantially contribute to shed light on the Firearm Protocol impact on armed violence. These are the introduction of a country peer review for all states parties to the Firearm Protocol, which includes an assessment by the peers of states' performances to fulfill their obligation under the protocol, and the provision, at least in the paper, that civil society stakeholders, NGOs, academia, and private sector have a role to play in the review process. This especially with the aim to overtake the above referred limitation in terms of transparency and inclusiveness that accompany the monitoring exercise of the Firearm Protocol implementation in the past. The adoption of the review mechanism in 2000 was accompanied with great expectation. But where does the review mechanism stand now? After a 2 years preparatory phase, the review mechanism was launched formally in 2020. During last 3 years, the review mechanism has faced a number of difficulties to become operational. First of all, a delay and in some cases also the lack of the nomination of focal points and governmental experts, which is the first essential step towards allowing a country review to effectively start. This slow path of the reviewing process resulted in limited substantial progress of the review of the implementation of the first thematic cluster of the Firearm Protocol provision, which include norms on criminalization and marking of firearm. As of 3 October 2023, the recent data, only 60 out of 189 reviews were advancing. Another sensitive issue was that, contrary to our expectation, the limited transparency and inclusiveness of country reviews, both in self-assessment phase and in the evaluation by the peers of states parties' performances. I can go into more detail on this point as well during the discussion if you need it, if you deem it appropriate. Of course, this picture did not help, did not contribute to shed light on effectiveness of domestic implementation of and compliance with the Firearm Protocol, and more broadly to understand how to assess properly its impact on armed violence reduction. To conclude my preliminary observation, it seems quite clear to me that the difficulties that states parties and the UN Secretariat have encountered to operationalize the review mechanism in these 3 years, the first year of its functioning, as well as the limited involvement of civil society in the process, has marked a stunning block to advance the knowledge of the Firearm Protocol impact on armed violence reduction. In light of this stalemate, we as representative of academia and NGO should enhance our efforts, our research efforts to support states to progress in the implementation of the Firearm Protocol and to complement the review mechanism for the protocol. The idea of our research team for next step, and it come also on this point to discuss together, is that to continue our multidisciplinary studies, organizing specifically an international conference that will be held in spring 2024. And I'm very glad that the University of Milan will host this important event. This initiative would aim to consolidate, to underline rationale that accompany our studies from our beginning. First, the need to support a mixed methodology which combines data and legal indicators with others armed violence indicators, firearm homicide, suicide, the use of gun in committing serious crimes, and so on. Second, an integrated paradigm, that is to say, the proposal to make an assessment of armed violence that combines the impact of the Firearm Protocol and its complementarities and synergies with other global arms control regimes, including the UN Program of Action and the Arms Trade Treaty. The novelty, and this is a point to discuss today, the novelty of the conference, through which we expect to get fresh input and new results from research, will be the presentation of regional case studies that will test and validate the relevant indicators as well as their flexibility, also considering the specificity of some regional instruments to reduce armed violence. These case studies might perform, in my view, as a pilot initiative in a way, aiming to offer states inputs to address their implementation efforts through the monitoring mechanism established by different global arms control regime and for the purpose of domestic legislative reforms. I thank you, and I give back the floor to Anna, with the pleasure to come back on this issue during the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christian. Thank you also for introducing us to this conference that we are looking forward to. I think that you mentioned something very important about the role of academics and civil society in making the Firearm Protocol something that is supported by civil society and that is more part of the better known, let's say, by civil society. I think that we should mention, and I'm also wearing here the two hats that I have, also the hat of the vice chair of the Alliance of NGOs, that the constructive dialogues are representing an important opportunity. The constructive dialogues are a sort of recent initiative established after the approval of the review mechanism, and they give the possibility for one day to civil society to interact with member states, especially with the working groups on the different protocols of the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And I think that especially this year, that was the second year of testing and putting in place these constructive dialogues, we have seen how useful they can be in advancing this conversation between civil society and member states to make sure that civil society voice is better heard. So I would like to thank both speakers. I think we get now into a more choral part of this meeting. And I see in the audience that we have the pleasure of having Luigi De Martino from the Small Arms Survey. And you see on this slide that the Small Arms Survey will be a co-organizer of the April event. And I would like to know if we can open the floor to Luigi De Martino, if we can open his microphone. Luigi.
One second. Okay. It seems that you can hear me. Good. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Emil and Christian Ponte for the organizing this panel. And I just wanted to mention that the survey is, for those who may not know us, is a center of applied knowledge in the field of proliferation and arms control, and in terms of armed violence reduction and prevention. We exist for the last, well, next year will be 25 years, and we have been created to support international processes such as the UN Program of Action, but also the Firearms Protocol, and now more recently the Arms Trade Treaty, in terms of policy support, data analysis, and then work with states and other organizations in view to establish and implement strong or effective controls mechanisms. Now, I think the conversation today is very important because it puts the light on the fact that many countries, despite the fact of being adhering to an instrument such as the Firearms Protocol, may not be in the position of fully implement it. We see in our daily practice sometimes how the reality in terms of implementation and compliance on the ground are shed a different light on what the reality is, despite the fact that a country may have adhered to this instrument. In many cases, countries work maybe in silos. Data may have been collected for knowing, to understand what the level of violence has been. Sometimes you may have disaggregated data on the firearms-related violence, but it's rarely translated into what happens with the data on the firearms, how the firearms-related data is used in terms of policy and programming. And so data may exist, but it's not used in a useful manner. And often what lacks is a sharing of the data at national level already within the government, but in many cases not. If it happens within a government, doesn't go outside of it, and that may be problematic. So first of all, it would be important to be able to see what data exists, how it is shared, and how it is used by states and with the support of civil society and other organizations or relevant actors. This could be in certain cases private sector, in other cases maybe somebody else or academia. Now, that will provide kind of a more information on what happens in between the pillars that Anna was presenting at the beginning in the theory of change. You may have information on the ratification and at the end on the pillar about data on violence, but often you don't know a lot of what happens in the middle. I think the fact that next year this international conference will try to go down at national level and shed light there what happens in the middle with using case studies, case study approach. I think it will be important to make sure that we can start saying something a bit more structured about the role of data in policy making and the role of the firearms protocol in terms of as a contribution of the firearms protocol towards arms violence reduction and prevention ideally. From our side, I think that our ongoing work in the Caribbean, for example, will be able to provide some case study for that. Our regional study that shared this year in May, I believe, May, June this year, provides an overview of the challenges of firearms trafficking and violence in the Caribbean. This is a study done together with CARICOM Impact and with the states of the Caribbean region. Our work continues there, and it's also a partnership not only with law enforcement and judiciary, but also with public health institutions of the region and with university of the regions. This will show the importance of working together to understand the effectiveness of implementation of national, regional, or globally frameworks in terms of compliant with the individual frameworks, but also in terms of impact and reduction of violence at the regional level. So we are happy to support the organization of the conference next year, and we hope that there will be a strong attendance with other case studies from other regions to continue this discussion and test what would be interesting in not only indicators but collaborations between state and non-state organizations towards the ultimate goal of reducing armed violence in a state or in a region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luigi. It's great to hear about the support of the Small Arms Survey. That is an important player, as we know. And as you said, there is a call. Actually, there is a call for papers that will be issued soon. I think that we are getting ready so that all organizers can distribute to their networks this call for papers for the case studies. Maybe, Christian, you want to tell us a bit more about this? Christian, can you
Anna, sorry, my connection is not more stable, so I miss your last words. I do apologize. Could you repeat, please?
I was just suggesting that you mentioned something about the call for papers, if you wish something more. I think we have problems with Christian. So, okay, maybe he will be able to reconnect later. And so thank you very much, Luigi. Thank you for being with us today. As I said at the beginning, we are encouraging everyone to ask questions. I see that we have already several questions in the Q&A. And Emil has kindly agreed to read them. But before that, I would like to invite everyone who would like to ask questions to either raise your hand or make yourself visible in the chat. Questions or comments. I see that we have several friends. I see already a hand from Tobias Krakler. And what else? Okay. So maybe while the speakers read the questions in the Q&A and prepare for the responses, maybe I can give the floor to Tobias Krakler. Is that okay? Can we unmute Tobias?
Hello, I hope it works. Can you hear me? Perfect. Hi, my name is Tobias Krakler. I'm the treasurer of the Alliance. And Anna mentioned at the end of the presentations, the constructive dialogues. And my question is, how can we get a even more meaningful participation of civil society in the constructive dialogues on firearms? It seems that in contrast to the other constructive dialogues, it is a very expert-heavy forum, whereas in others, especially the one, for example, on human trafficking, it draws large crowds and it's more emotional based, which is strange as the topic of firearms usually, especially in media, is a very emotional. So it should draw even larger crowds. So my question again is, how can we get more civil society participation in the constructive dialogues on firearms?
Thank you, Toby. I would say more and more. You say the more participated, also more expert participation, because we had very good experts, but perhaps there is no sufficient basis and there is no discussion. So maybe it may be possible to think of pre-constructive dialogue meetings to create an expectation and an atmosphere and a little bit of a better basis of knowledge to prepare for these events. So thank you for your question. And when we give the floor back to the panelists, they may also wish to address this issue. Okay, so I see that we have several questions here in the Q&A. I think there are some that are addressed specifically to Professor Ponti. Then there is a more general one from Marco. And a good one from David Atwood. Thank you. So, okay, I think we can try with Emil going first and addressing what he has seen. Emil, The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, I see a couple of questions here that I can perhaps address together or try to address. One question, Ewan Grant says, are there not many production and transit nations which will not enforce the protocol or cooperate with states which do? Good question. And then a related question from an anonymous, which is talking more about the context in the United States and to what extent are they, the states and other states in the region complying with the protocol. I mean, so the first answer is that the United States is not a party to the protocol. So the as a legal instrument, it sort of falls within the US's reluctance to sign on to international legally binding mechanisms. However, having said that, the US is a very strong promoter of international arms control within the UN system without being a signatory to the protocol. So they're an active and productive member of the international community at this level. I think the question about what specific activities or lack of activities are taking place in different parts of the world that may be hotspots for trafficking or maybe hotspots for illicit manufacture is not to kick the ball down the road, but that those are the kind of regional questions that we would try to unpack in, you know, as we look at regional case studies in early next year, leading up to the workshop. You first have to sort of assess where those places are, and then look at how protocol states have adopted the protocol or ratified it or actually taken steps, and all that's sort of what we're proposing to do. And some of the questions here related to, you know, North America, the Caribbean, as Luigi mentioned, is a very important region as well for trafficking. And the Small Arms Survey has done really amazing exemplary work in looking at trafficking and illicit weapons in the region. Some of that needs to be associated with some work to analyze protocol adoption, implementation, enforcement, and so on. So these are the kinds of questions that need to be unpacked, which we haven't done yet. I hope that's somewhat helpful. Back to Anna.
Thank you very much, Emil. And indeed, we have a question that is actually for Luigi for this Small Arms Survey about the Caribbean study. Can you send a link to the Caribbean study to the group? I don't know if this is possible to get a link. We have the two questions. I would like to go first with the questions we have for Professor Ponti. So how to detect and what specifically may be the legal indicators to assess armed violence reduction related to effective implementation of and compliance with the firearms protocol? Yes. Christian, can you hear me?
Anna, I'm
yes.
struggling.
Hi. Can you find another way to connect while we address another couple of questions? If you can find another connection.
So I will try to connect by another device.
Exactly. So we can maybe we can address another couple of questions in the meantime.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So we may go to David's question that I think is a question that maybe Emil can help us. Emil and Luigi both may help us in answering this question. It is the question goes: thank you for this important initiative. Measuring impact is vital for all sorts of reasons. What effort will there be to bring the learning from this work to the 4th review conference of the Program of Action next year, particularly in light of the conference being planned for April? So maybe Emile and Luigi, you can start answering this. It's a pity that Christian is not connected now, but we can start reflecting on this. Emile.
Okay, thank you. It's a great question because I think part of what we're looking at here, obviously we're focusing on the protocol because it's unlike the program of action, which is a large basket of recommended and suggested measures that go far beyond illicit manufacture and illicit trafficking, but to the whole range of issues dealing with proliferation issues. But they're connected in terms of our efforts should not only to be focused on measuring impacts of the protocol, but other instruments as well. So I think it is the first thing to say is that it would be very wise to sort of inform each other's processes of how advancements in trying to think about measuring the impacts of instruments can be advanced. So whatever we learn from April should be produced in a sort of a report or a sort of white paper that can be delivered to the Program of Action Review Conference next summer. Obviously, all of us are working on other specific project work that's also related to the review conference. So finding the right way to deliver those messages will be a challenge. I think personally that to the extent that we can involve states themselves that are parties to the program, to the protocol, and who are also active in the program of action, that's a way to also deliver some of these cross-pollinations, to have a state itself deliver some of the messages from our discussions. So that just goes to the question of the importance of us involving states in this discussion as well. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much, Emile. Luigi, would you like to add something to these initial reflections?
Yes, if my mic is open. Okay, I agree with Emile, of course, that the states are important players in this case, because when they set up, take the example of countries that they develop a regional or national strategy for arms control, and in that strategy or in these national action plans, they usually should be able to look at what are targets and indicators to measure the progress of implementing these strategies. Now, we know that in the ideal case, states should be able to link their national level with regional instruments and with global instruments. Interestingly, in the REFCON 4, so in the 4th review conference that will take place in New York in June next year, the question of national targets and measurability of the implementation of UN Program of Action will be one of the key arguments or key topics discussed at the REFCON 4. This will be an ideal moment to also bring together the question of measuring the impact of UN POA as well as the firearms protocol, because as we have seen, these frameworks don't work in silos, work when considered as a whole. That, I think, the experiences of states in implementing national strategies or regional strategies will be very important to start being able to provide data of effectiveness of small arms control frameworks, such as the firearms protocol.
Excellent. No, thank you. This is very good to know that maybe we are going to be on time. I don't know if Christian is back with us. Are you connected, Christian? Can you hear? Can you speak?
I can hear you very well right now. What about you?
We can hear you very well.
Although I'm not able to activate my video, but anyway, I can hear you very well.
Okay, we have seen you before, so okay. As long as you can speak, yeah. Please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I read that there are two questions addressed to me in the chat. The first is,
wait a second, Christian. Can you just because in your absence we picked up David Atwood's question, and it was very interesting for the April conference about bringing the discussion to the attention of the fourth review conference on the program of action. And we heard from Emile and Luigi that this is really something that will need the engagement of states. And I know that you are planning indeed to approach a couple of states to help us accompanying this outcome to the diplomatic level. Would you like to add something on this before you address the other questions?
No. I think yes. I think that it's a good idea, and I do hope that our effort to involve some states, and I do not refer expressly to the states who I'm thinking about, but because we don't have yet their agreement to be part of our efforts and our research projects. But I will do my best, of course, to involve states at diplomatic level, and some ideas already on this. So I hope that this idea will become a concrete result soon.
Excellent. So please address your questions now.
Yes, if I'm not wrong, I saw.
Can you repeat? Can you read the question again? Would you like me to read them?
No. I realized that in order not to lose time, I realized that the first question dealt with the indicator of effective implementation and compliance. Now, as international lawyer, of course, implementation or compliance with an international treaty is a very good indicator of the performances of this treaty and its effectiveness. And specifically, I do believe that the Firearm Protocol implementation and compliance phases may bring a significant role to this impact assessment exercise on armed violence. For those who are not familiar, of course, implementation and compliance are two conceptually distinct notions and entail different processes. While implementation is the process of putting international commitment into practice, that is to say, the passage of legislation, the creation of administrative and internal bodies in order to fulfill the international obligation, for instance. But compliance refers to other steps, and especially the state conformity or identity of state behavior with a specific international rule. As for the implementation, this exercise requires a careful examination of domestic legal framework, of course. That is to say, to establish if this framework is aligned with the international standards, and hence it permits to the states to fulfill their international obligation. Compliance, on the contrary, require a more deep evaluation of state practice, I would say, to assess, in order to assess how these norms are enforced at domestic level by daily activities, by daily work of practitioners. And by that, to identify if this practice is suitable to achieve the targets and the aim established by the treaty. Having said this about definition, of course, the identification of legal indicators on implementation require the monitoring, the study, the analysis of documents such as the self-assessment questionnaire, national reports delivered by the states parties, keeping information, qualitative and quantitative information on progress in implementation. This can be used, for instance, using checklist and so on international element. More specifically, legal indicators to, again, indirectly measure the impact of the Firearm Protocol legal framework on armed violence, in my view, for instance, may include correlation between the most relevant substantive norm of the Firearm Protocol, such as criminalization of illicit manufacturing, criminalization of illicit trafficking, marking, and licensing system, as well as authorization system, and the impact of the enactment of these norms on the reduction, for instance, of homicide or other grave and violent crimes. The identification of legal indicators on compliance is in a way more difficult, since it requires to measure, to assess, and to evaluate the daily state practice of states and of internal operators. So, in a way, even if the failure to enforce international norm is generally very common, but it is more difficult to ascertain than the failure to implement international norms. To this extent, possible indicator of compliance, in my view, can be found, for instance, in figures and rates dealing with seizures linked with illicit manufacturing and illicit trafficking, successful investigation and law enforcement operation, including international cooperation, prosecution and judicial cases on illicit manufacturing and illicit trafficking, and the impact that they have, for instance, to limit the diversion from the licit to the illicit market of firearms. Of course, we have always to keep clear in our mind that this correlation dealing with implementation and compliance should always be considered as in terms of association more than in terms of strict causation, because this is, I think, it's a clear limit of normative norm and legal impact indicators on armed violence assessment. The second question was, Anna, about the review mechanism.
It is regarding the review mechanism. What
yes.
were the major obstacles encountered regarding the involvement of civil society actors, both in the self-assessment and in the evaluation of the performances of state parties?
Okay, so as I said in my presentation, so far we had only 60 review process ongoing. More than 130 review have not yet started, contrary to the expectation. 25 review processes are still at self-assessment stage. 33 are at the stage of written feedback, and only 2 reach the final step of observation by the peer team to the state under review. So this process, as for the involvement of civil society, presented a lot of critical points. For instance, with reference to the self-assessment phase, that is the collection of information by states on the implementation of the protocol, it is remarkable to point out that notwithstanding the efforts of the Secretariat to UNODC to support the engagement of civil society in the self-assessment exercise, at least as far as I know, according to official documents that circulated, there is no evidence of the participation of civil society in the country reviews. Moreover, states' responses to the self-assessment questionnaire were not made available to civil society. With reference to the evaluation phase, notwithstanding the wide participation of civil society in the so-called constructive dialogues, and here my perception is different from the one of Tobias, because I attended to both constructive dialogue, which were very participated as far as I remember. But the limit of such of this meeting relied on the fact that this meeting, of course, due to the slow pass of the review exercise, as I said, did not provide substantive discussion, did not provide substantive results about the ongoing process at domestic level, and hence, so far, it did not contribute to shed light on the effectiveness of the domestic implementation of the Firearm Protocol, neither compliance with it, and of course, more broadly, to have a contribution about the impact of this tool on armed violence reduction. So, by the way, I agree that the constructive dialogue brought a lot of, as you said, Anna, contribution to have a thematic discussion, for instance, about the integrated approach, complementarity and synergies between different arm control instruments. That is quite important, of course, but precisely with reference to the point of the review exercise, we did not have so far satisfactory results. That is at least my view.
Yeah, Christian, we need to close. Thank you very much. We have 3 minutes, and I have a question that I would like to address myself. It's a question from Marco. How do we adapt current nationally applied sustainable development indicators to monitor arms control, given the transnational nature of armed violence? So here there is a little bit of the key point about the availability of indicators. As you may know, the Sustainable Development Goals framework of indicators includes one indicator on arms that is not something that can measure much. It is what is called an aspirational indicator regarding the tracing, the ability of states to trace arms, the legal origin of arms, of seized arms. So in this respect, indeed, the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals helps a lot from the violence point of view, because you have the indicators on homicides that, of course, have been enriched by the exercise of collecting data at the national level on the push of Agenda 2030, but we don't have much on arms and on the overall issue of transnational organized crime. So indeed, this is something that with our work, we may also stress and highlight the need for better data. I would like to give 1 second the floor to Emile, and we will be cut in 1 minute. Emile.
Thanks. Just then 10 seconds to say thank you. And I just, I think there's a lot of expertise in the coalition of partners that is involved in this project. And for example, the Small Arms Survey was engaged at the last constructive dialogue very productively on questions of illicit manufacture. And I think that this is a great place to start and to continue the discussion and bring it to the events next year. So I just want to say thank you for the chance to talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you all participants. And looking forward to seeing you in April at the